Salvation Army Adult Rehabilitation Centers want you to understand addictions. Addictions, who, what, when, where, how, and why. Today we're going to focus on some basic definitions for addictions and some things to do about it. Later in the series, you will learn about the brain biochemistry, enabling, relapse prevention, and a number of other topics. An earlier definition of addictions, it is a chronic, progressive, terminal disease of self-destruction, whether conscious or unconscious. What does chronic mean?
Chronic is something that could happen over and over again. It could be a chronic illness, it could be a chronic weakness, it could be a chronic habit.
So a chronic illness or disease might be diabetes?
Chronic cough could be several things, sure.
Progressive, what does progressive mean?
Means it's ongoing.
Doesn't stop, continues,
yeah,
gets worse over time?
Yeah, as time go on, it gets worse.
And terminal, what does terminal mean?
It could mean fatal.
Could mean fatal. We say in the 12 steps, jail, insanity, or death. So this definition, it's a chronic, progressive, terminal disease of self-destruction, whether conscious or unconscious. Now, a basic definition of disease has to do with organ and defect in systems. So any organ system in our body, heart, liver, lungs, circulatory, can have some kind of defect in it and presents symptoms. Addiction has symptoms of its own, some of which we're going to examine today. Self-destruction. Anybody ever out there who felt like their lifestyle prior to recovery was self-destructive?
Yeah.
Yes.
What kind of things kept happening to you?
Unfulfilled expectations, not going through and following through on just simple goals that you set for yourself.
So you couldn't meet your plans, you couldn't meet your ideals, you couldn't meet your values.
Any.
What about self-destruction in a physical sense or a spiritual sense or a mental sense?
Yeah, from a moral aspect, certainly you begin to lie more and more, you delude yourself. From a physical standpoint, it's getting used to being sick.
And that's the normal way you're going to feel all the time.
Yes.
Whether conscious or unconscious. A lot of times people who don't understand addictions talk about blaming people who keep on repeating the same mistakes over again, just like you referred to. So it looks like it's a conscious choice. That picking up alcohol or whatever drug is a matter of choice, a matter of decision. Is that the case? In your experience?
Most of the time.
Yes.
Most of what addiction does to you, you can say you're really unconscious because you're making a conscious decision, but it's not based on sound judgment.
Did you ever have an opportunity or a chance where you were in recovery for a period of time and you suddenly found yourself in a bar or having picked up a drug and made no decision about it at all?
Yeah.
So it can be both conscious and unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the idea that it's self-destruction, did that ever occur to you in the throes of your addiction?
Yeah. Because with the addiction itself, it's like once the addiction takes over, that's what's in control. So some of your behavior is more unconscious because it's not you, it's the addiction taking over.
Okay, so the addiction itself has control of you in your life and most of your decisions.
Most certainly.
It's interesting when you start because you consciously know that you're doing something wrong, and then over time it becomes normal and you don't have that thought anymore.
What you have to do to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go to the next definition. This is a more recent definition and a little bit longer, so we'll try and take this apart. It's a chronic, progressive, terminal disease of the brain chemistry characterized by biogenetic predisposition. Let's stop there for a moment. What does that phrase mean to you, biogenetic predisposition?
Well, for me, it means there are certain chemicals in the brain that's not functioning the way they're supposed to.
Okay, let's take that apart though. Bio means body, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening to us biologically. Genetic means what we've inherited.
Mm-hmm.
So According to this definition, there are certain people who are predisposed or more likely to become addicted than other people. Biogenetic predisposition, where the use of a substance, alcohol, or other drugs cannot be predictably controlled by the individual, and the resulting behaviors are often self-destructive, as well as being destructive to all aspects of a person's life. So we're looking at a chronic progressive terminal disease, like we talked about before, that involves how the brain works in relationship to a substance. When I used to assess people, one of the questions I would ask them is, what was your first experience getting high or getting drunk like? Most people would say, it wasn't pleasant, I got sick, I got in trouble. But when the person has become alcoholic or addict, a lot of times I would ask the question, what was it like? And their face would light up like they just saw fireworks and Christmas morning all at once. And I say, well, what? It was a great experience. And they say it was a magical experience sometimes. What happened? Well, I could drink more or use more than anybody else. I was the one who drove people home. And all of a sudden, I was the person who was in charge and taking the lead role of me and my buddies. So that shows us that from the very first time or close to it, a person can have a higher tolerance than most people would have, indicating that how the substance works in that person's brain is different from the normal person. Another thing we talk about a lot is we talk about loss of control. Many times people will, particularly in the early to middle stages of their addiction, will say, well, I don't have to use it for a while. I can do fine for a while. I can even drink a bit or take a bit of this substance, this drug, and not have a problem. But then what happens with loss of control?
You lose it.
You lose it?
Yeah. Once it becomes an addiction, a lot of times we are addicted to certain chemicals and don't know it until we try to control it. And that's when you'll realize, hey, I can't do without this.
So a person might go for a period of time,
yes,
and not experience complete intoxication or drunkenness, but by the same token, cannot predict what's going to happen on any given episode of drinking or other use.
Well, part of that is the lying that I was talking about earlier. When you say I'll only drink on the weekends, the weekend suddenly becomes longer. The weekend becomes Thursday, and it just keeps going that way.
Thursday and Friday and Saturday
Yep.
and Sunday, and Monday you don't feel too good, so you want some hair of the dog and so
Exactly.
on, right? So, as some of you were saying earlier, what happens to you, what you do, you don't recognize as self-destructive. You make a choice. Well, either I'm going to feel really bad and get in trouble, or I'm going to use and feel like I can navigate through the day. The obsession with obtaining the drug of choice and the compulsion to misuse or abuse it becomes the central focus of a person's life. In other words, getting the substance, using the substance, recovering from use of the substance, and then getting supply again are what becomes the focus of a person's life. Obsession, thinking about the substance, its consequences, can I afford it, where can I get it, and the compulsion to use, knowing full well that it's not going to end up in a happy state when you continue to use over and over again in an addictive way. Thus, addiction affects all areas of a person's life, including physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Well, the physical is obvious. We know that alcohol and other drugs affect all organ systems in our body: our brain, our circulatory system, our heart, our lungs, our liver, our kidney. For example, a lot of people have what's called peripheral neuropathy in advanced stages of alcoholism or addiction, where their circulatory system has caused nerve damage, so they have pain and discomfort in walking or cannot feel their feet. Mental. What happens to a person's mental abilities, your cognitive abilities, during addiction?
They lapse.
That's right.
They're no longer as sharp as they once were. I mean, it's impossible to think in a normal manner when something is controlling you other than the brain's natural chemicals.
So you're obsessed and preoccupied. Your thinking is fuzzy because of the physical effects of the substance. How about emotional? What happens to the emotional state in addiction?
You're right.
You become numb.
Become numb?
Totally numb.
Because you can't stand to care about what you're doing or what's going on or how it's affecting other people in your life?
Absolutely.
Is there another side to it? Is there another emotional at the other side of it where people can't control their emotions? They feel crying and depressed and sad and sometimes suicidal?
Well, that's simply because there are no real emotions there. Because of the addiction, the only emotions you have are associated with the addiction. And the addiction is used to more or less medicate or numb you from the things you don't want to feel. So it becomes one or the other. Either I'm drunk or I'm emotionally disturbed.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people talk about the kind of psychic pain, emotional pain that they experience, and the need to use a substance or alcohol in order to numb that and just not feel anything, to get intoxicated to the point of oblivion.
Yep.
What about spiritual?
You can forget about spirituality.
First to go.
Yes, spiritual death.
Immediately.
We'll talk more about spirituality, and let's complete this part of the definitions. One's lifestyle is narrowed to the point where obtaining the drug, using the drug, recovering from its effects, and seeking supply for the next time is the purpose of life. So one's life becomes more and more narrowed. Next slide, okay. So we see the entire definition. Let's go to the next slide and talk about spirituality. And next, the generations of family addiction. How many people that you're aware of, either yourselves if you want to share, or people that you worked with, have an alcoholic mother or father? Would you say? 40%, 50%, 60%? What would you say?
I'd say about 36%.
Yes.
About 36%, okay. To be exact, okay. So what does that tell us about the likelihood of a child, of a parent like that, becoming alcoholic or addicted?
It's highly
likely.
It's very high.
Highly likely, much more than normal. What about abstinent parents? Anybody ever have abstinent parents, or have people you've worked with whose parents were abstinent, didn't use alcohol or drugs at all?
Yes.
Yeah, my parents were both abstinent, but it skipped a generation because 3 out of the 4 of my grandparents were alcoholics.
3 out of 4 of your grandparents were alcoholic, but your parents were abstinent. So let's go to the next one then. Grandparents, uncles, and aunts.
Yes.
So let's examine that, because some people will say, well, my parent, even though they had an alcoholic parent, my parents were able to stay abstinent. So how could it possibly be biogenetic or biological in nature? Well, there's more to this than just social learning. One could say, well, if you have an alcoholic mother or father, you learn how to drink or you learn how to use drugs as a way to solve problems or avoid problems. That may be true. The abstinent parent, as you were just pointing out, the abstinent parent oftentimes has an alcoholic grandparent themselves. So the generation we're talking about has an alcoholic or drug-addicted grandparent. Most abstinent people who have had parents who are alcoholic or addicted are abstinent as a way to defend against having made a decision, I'm not going to become like mom or dad. And in a lot of cases, when we get involved with a family like that, we find that that generation is really what we call white knuckling it. Emotionally and in some other ways, it's almost as if they're living out a pattern of being addicted to alcohol or other drugs, yet not having actually used the substance. So when we evaluate or assess someone, we want to look at these factors, not just their parents, and not just the grandparents, but maybe uncles or aunts.
Yes.
we often find that if you have a family of, let's say, 5 siblings who have an alcoholic parent, 1 or 2 will become alcoholic or addicted, and 1 or 2 will marry an alcoholic or addict as a way to try to work out what they've experienced as children growing up in that kind of home. So the drug and its effect on people's lives continues through generation after generation if left untreated or uneducated. Next. Spirituality and addiction. Now, there's a lot of ways to define spirituality. I like to talk about spirituality being our relationship to our own values. We all grow up with certain values. Our family gives us values, our school, our society, society's laws gives us values, our church gives us values. Values that are automatic to our culture and have been learned at home, church, school, and work. Spirituality is our relationship to God, Jesus, or whatever we view as a higher power. When we violate our spirituality, that is, our values, because of our behavior as an addict or an alcoholic, then we are out of sync, out of relationship that we desire with God or Jesus, whatever we call the higher power. As humans, we are in relationship to God, others, and ourselves. When any of these relationships break down, we can become isolated and dehumanized. So, what happens to the alcoholic or addict in terms of isolation and being disconnected?
I can answer that one because it was really important to me. I was in a meeting one time and a gentleman was talking about how empty he felt because he didn't have God, he didn't have his family anymore. And my comment was, well, I thought that was the goal, was to get that empty. Then I didn't have to answer to anybody else.
So if you felt that empty and that isolated, then nobody needed to care about you. You didn't need to care about anybody else. No, you didn't owe an explanation to anybody else.
I was done.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So how many people that we see that come to the ARC are in a state of isolation and feeling dehumanized and feeling lost and angry and resentful because they've so disconnected from their own spirituality?
Hundreds of them.
The numbers are high.
Very high.
Most of the people that we do come in contact with, sometimes the relationships that you want, when they don't work out, that emptiness causes you to look for a higher power. And it's not always easy to find because you're using him for something instead of just trying to make a relationship with God. That's the most important word that's in that whole paragraph, is relationship. A lot of people look for relationships in a lot of physical ways and they never get satisfaction. But to find relationship with something or someone that you can't touch, see, but you can feel them. So that's kind of hard for them, but that's the ultimate goal.
Okay, thank you. So a relationship is really at the crux of being human.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a relationship with ourselves, with other people, and with God as we understand God.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So once that starts to break down, we have become less and less human in terms of our ability ourselves. Spirituality, expectations. A lot of times when we receive people in the ARC or other programs, and we're try to help them get reconnected to God or to Jesus or to church or religion, we find that they're hostile and fearful of that because they've grown up with expectations of perfection. They've probably grown up with expectations of being labeled as full of sin and sinful and a need to be ashamed of themselves. Sometimes as a result of the church that they were involved in, sometimes as a result of what their parents did. For example, if we have an alcoholic or addicted parents, chances are they're going to fluctuate between being involved in their addiction and being remorseful and guilty and ashamed and apologetic and buying gifts and trying to make up for it, forever going up and down with failure to continue in a productive parental relationship. loss of control. We talked about that a few minutes ago. We live in a world, we live in a society where, in Western society, where we're expected to be in control. We're expected to exert power in our lives, and if we do all the right things, we're going to get a home, a car, a relationship, a marriage, a kid, or kids, and all those things that we are raised to believe we deserve to have. Well, if you get to the point that we talked about earlier, where your purpose in life is to get your supply, use your supply, recover from your supply, and get your supply again, and like you said, if our life is narrowed to the point that that's the most important thing, where is our control and power gone? It's disappeared, isn't it?
Yes.
And sometimes the emptiness that you referred to as a spiritual thing is partly a product, at least, of having no control or ability to make decisions like society has taught us we should do. Guilt and shame. How many people are extremely troubled by feeling guilty for the things they've done and not done when they're in the throes of their addiction?
Quite a few.
And people stay guilty, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I believe that guilt can be productive. Because if we do something or don't do something and we feel guilty as a result, the lesson is we don't need to repeat that. And then we're not going to feel guilty again. But what happens to the alcoholic or addict as we look at the idea of shame, and shame being a feeling about yourself during addiction?
It stunts your growth a lot of times. Where you're trying to get to, the road you're traveling to get there. Sometimes you run into those shameful situations. And a lot of times that's difficult for an addict to address, especially if he hasn't made that spiritual connection yet.
Okay, anyone else? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, actually, shame will actually spiritually seems like a spiritual murder-suicide.
A spiritual murder suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
A lot of people are suffering so much from shame that they tend to stop living. They're living every day to day, but on the inside, they're just dead because of the shame and guilt. And like Larry was saying, you keep going, searching for that, but it hits you in the face every time, because where you go, there that shame is.
And we seek relief.
We seek
And the relief that we seek might be in using the substance again,
Absolutely.
so we're not going to feel or think anything.
Absolutely.
Well, the difference is guilt is about behavior. Shame is about yourself, about your person.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have grown up in a situation where they hear nothing but you should be ashamed of yourself for this, or the parent who has the problem, I'm ashamed of myself for what I've become, or the grandmother says that to them, or siblings, or whatever. They become pariahs in the neighborhood. So that shame becomes a thing you carry that you can't get rid of. You feel like you deserve it, and it's the label that's been put on you over and over and over again. Religion or 12 steps. You know, sometimes we get arguments from people, suggestions that religion is going to do it so you can recover with religion, or 12 steps is going to do it for you, or one or the other is not the right thing to do, and some kind of, in my point of view, a useless argument entails. So, what to do about that? Christianity asks us to seek the will of God, to submit or follow God's will. In the throes of our addiction, we're not capable of being able to do that, because the preoccupation and the use and the obsession, the compulsion and the need to escape the painful and shameful feelings perpetuate that separation from God in our lives. Now, where's the hope? Let's look at, the hope is in our forgiveness. Now let's look at step 1 in the 12 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I like to use the we version because we're all in this together. So we admit we're powerless over alcohol or whatever drug or perhaps behavior has made our lives unmanageable. Being able to say that you've lost power to make that kind of decision can be a very demoralizing thing for people. We touched on that earlier when we were talking about control. But what we also know is that, in fact, we're powerless over nearly everything in our lives. And if we decide to really work the steps and we decide to submit to the will of God in our religion, then our power is only to give up our power and surrender to the fact that our lives are unmanageable and we're powerless over a substance, and that if we let God take charge, God is in charge. So power is a kind of a paradoxical, difficult thing for us to convey and to understand. I see powerlessness as a gift. If we're going to be in relationship with ourselves, with other people, and particularly with God, then we don't need to have the power. We can give up the power. That's an ongoing struggle for all of us because we're human and we're driven to want to take charge and be full of power and make decisions and take control and so on. And by the same token, we may know spiritually and emotionally and mentally that we need to surrender to the will of God. If we believe in God, as the steps say later, we turn our will and our life over to God as we understand them. One of the things that I've come to realize over the years of working in the field is that most people who are alcoholics or addicts have a great deal of trouble forgiving themselves. Why do you think that's the case? Did you ever have trouble forgiving yourself?
Most of the times because my surroundings was always reminding me. So if it's difficult to forgive yourself of a reoccurring incident and you're blaming yourself for it.
Okay.
And there's a time, especially in early recovery, where you go through the woulda, coulda, shoulda piece of life, and you do have tremendous regret, and you have to move past that.
So those regrets and resentment can keep you stuck in the same miserable place, just like Larry was referring to. So whose job is it to forgive?
Yours.
You're going to have to speak up. Those mics want to pick up on what you're saying.
If you don't forgive yourself.
Okay, who enables us to forgive ourselves?
God.
Okay.
God.
So forgiveness is God's job.
Yes.
A lot of our folks, and some of us have been in that position ourselves, we felt like we were too bad or too guilty or too broken or whatever to be able to forgive ourselves. We didn't deserve to be forgiven. Many people I've talked to said, oh, I'm not worthy of being forgiven. Right. And I would say, well, whose job is it to forgive? And they would say, well, it's God's job. Oh, so you're doing God's job for God now because you're not letting God forgive you. How do we obtain forgiveness?
We ask for it.
We ask for it.
Yep.
It's that simple.
We ask for it.
It's that simple. So one of the things that we want to be able to learn and understand is we deserve to be forgiven. All we have to do is ask for it. And in that asking, we are repenting of what we've done or not done. So that forgiveness allows us to forgive ourselves, to forgive other people, and many times to forgive God, whom we may blame for having put us in such a miserable life and a miserable situation.
Yes, yes, yes.
So addiction runs the gamut: physical, mental, emotional, and finally spiritual. And the spiritual piece, after a person is well and understands this disease that they have, that spiritual piece is what we try to help people with through the Bible, through the studies of the Bible and God and Jesus Christ and church, and through the 12 steps. And there's a convergence or a joining of these things for the people who we try to help get into and stay into recovery. Are there any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.